Hello, my name is Linus Chan, and my talk is on latent psychological hazards of living in a volatile environment, effects of socio-ecological stressors on political ideology and political restriction. What's the rationale behind this talk? Well, my background is in cross-cultural and political psychology. My team's research aims to examine political ideology and political restriction, and often how these varies across cultures. So one way to examine politics is under the lens of socio-ecological psychology, namely, how do things such as pathogens, climates, topography, how do these socio-ecological stressors influence people's psychology in different environments? So in this talk, I aim to share my work on socio-ecological psychology and how it influences politics. And namely, I'd like to share four research projects, three of which are published and one of which is currently under review. So what is socio-ecological psychology? Well, classic social psychology, it aims to examine how people's behavior and cognition is influenced by different social contexts. So the most popular research areas are stereotyping, conformity, obedience, and other also popular topics such as aggression or prosocial behavior. These are often studied in social psychology. How do different people, how do different primes, for example, affect these behaviors? So these behaviors are often examined through lab studies with manipulations with confederates or in online studies in these crowdsourced platforms such as Amazon Mechanical Turk and Prolific. In fact, online studies are gaining more traction as depicted by this graph. This graph shows that in 2005, there were not a lot of online studies, like 7, in JPSP, JSP, and PSPB, three of the most popular journals in social psychology. But in 2010, there has been an increase in online studies relative to offline studies, and in 2015, it's it's basically half online and half offline. And if the trends continue, then it's most likely going to be studies that are done online over offline, especially during the time of the pandemic. Okay, so a recent subfield that emerged is socio-ecological psychology. So instead of looking at how different social contexts by different people influence people's psychology, it's more about looking at how the natural or artificial environment, the environment itself, influence people's psychology. So I now plan to share four major findings or concepts in socio-ecological psychology. So the first one is dangerous versus safe environments. How does that influence people's psyche? Well, some research found that regions with more historical threats, and these threats are like droughts, floods, or external threats from actual people, fosters tighter social norms. Um, and norms and cultures that are more tight cultures tend to have norms that um, encourage more social cohesion, and there's less room for deviance against these social norms. So in tight culture, where people have to abide by these certain norms and have to follow these conventions, they tend to have lower crime rates, sterner views on marriage, and more censorship. But they tend to be more productive, more efficient, more punctual, and more safe and loose, but also more conventional. But loose cultures, on the other hand, where there's fewer norms and norms that don't require that much social cohesion, these cultures tend to be more creative. There's more tolerant of alternative lifestyles, and there's more freedom of expression. However, loose cultures tend to be not as efficient and not as safe. Michelle Gelfand describes loose and tight cultures very well in her newest, 2018 book, Rule Makers, Rule Breakers. Okay, the next concept I like to, in social ecological psychology, I like to talk about is pathogen prevalence. So basically, how do the perceived prevalence of pathogens affect people's psyche? So pathogens have historically been the greatest threat to humans, more than wars, more than um, other things such as floods, droughts. Pathogens have killed so many people in the past. Hence, people have developed systems of emotion, behavior, and cognition to proactively avoid pathogen threat. And this is known as the behavioral immune system, coined by Mark Schaller. So, what Schaller argued was that because immunological responses are very metabolically costly and temporarily debilitating, such as getting a fever, such as um, getting like nausea and vomiting and all those things, it's more efficient to proactively avoid pathogen in the first place. Um, so just even the perceived threat of pathogen, avoiding it is good for not getting potentially infected. So high perceived pathogen threat has been linked to conformity, more conformity, xenophobia, collectivism, authoritarian personality traits, and even things like decreased extroversion, decreased sociosexuality, and decreased openness to experience. This is one of the graphs from Shaller's research, which shows that as there's more historical pathogen prevalence in each nation, there tends to be more, each nation tends to be more collectivistic. Makes sense. The next concept is population density. So dense places tend to elicit greater social comparison because there's more people around, and there's also more competition for limited resources. And there's a lot of people compare fewer resources, fewer spots for jobs, for example, fewer places in schools, fewer places for everything you want basically because of limited resources. And this motivates people to adopt what's called a slow life strategy. And people with a slow life strategy tend to invest in more education, more college educated, tends to be get married later, and have greater parental investment per child. Even experimental manipulations of density, just put someone in the lab, have them prime them, like have them think of living in a dense area, it makes people more future oriented. And what Rattel et al. Found in American Psychologist's paper recently published was that um, countries that are more high in density, so this is the top 25% of countries, the bottom 25% of countries, if they're more dense, regardless of the time period, it tends to be the fewer births per woman. And the last concept I'd like to share is proximity to equator, such that rates of violence tends to increase near the equator, and this is possibly due to opportunities for social interaction postulated by the routine activity theory. As people get near the equator, people tend to have more opportunities to interact, and then when people interact, there's a higher chance of any aggression or violence. Um, More recently, Paul Van Laage and colleagues have developed the clash model, climate aggression and self-control, where they posit that, as described by this graph, a temperature in the country affects people's life strategy, so fast or low uh, uh, life strategy, and their ability to control, like self-control, self-regulation, self-impulse control, and that in turn influences aggression and violence. Now, people's psyche affected by where their country is by the equator is not just about aggression. As we'll talk about in the future, the next paper, it also influences things like creativity and individualism. Okay, so after sharing things such as pathogens and um, proximity to equator, I'd like to share the four papers of the four research projects that um, my team has been working on. And I've called these part one, part two, part three, part four. So in part one, I like to talk about my work on how literacy rates are explained by latitude due to ecological stressors. In part two, I'd like to go over a review paper my team wrote about how and why volatile environments tend to produce politically conservative people who prefer hierarchy and authoritarianism. In part three, I'd like to talk about how autocratic countries, relative to democratic countries, show less consistent relationships with culture level variables such as collectivism and urbanity and wealth. And in part four, I'd like to share my findings on how distal ecological stressors such as climate and more proximal ecological stressors such as water quality, how these impact societal confidence. Okay, so part one, how are literacy rates influenced by latitude? Does a nation's position on Earth influence literacy rates? Well, our research suggests that it does. So literacy rates is associated with a lot of good outcomes, many, many good outcomes. But how are these sociological rates, stressors influencing literacy? Well, latitudinal psychology, also another subfield. It examines how cultural variations in where a nation is on the planet Earth is predictive of many outcomes, such that as a nation approaches the poles, north or south poles, it produces similar outcomes. But as a nation also approaches the equator, it also produces similar outcomes. And these outcomes include, well, aggression, as well as creativity and happiness. If we look at this figure, it shows that as nations move above or below the equator, these variables of creativity, life satisfaction, it tends to increase or decrease in predictable ways. Predictable as in both above and below, it's quite similar. Okay, so in this present study, we examine how latitude affects literacy due to pathogen stress, climate stress, wealth, and national tightness. So pathogen stress and climate stress affects literacy because if there's a lot of pathogen, if the country is too hot or too cold, if survival is threatened, then of course less resources would be available for literacy. Instead, the resources would be devoted and allocated towards surviving. Likewise, if a country does not have a lot of wealth, then that also undermines literacy because without wealth, there's not a lot of resources, not a lot of opportunities for schooling, and so on. And national tightness, which measures the extent to which societies emphasize traditional in-group structures. Nations that are very tight, they provide hierarchical societal structures where only a subset of people, usually those at the top of the hierarchy, are allowed to pursue education. So we want to examine if latitude affects literacy, and if that relationship is mediated by pathogen stress, climate stress, lack of wealth, and national tightness. So, okay. How our IVs were latitude and longitude. The dependent variable was literacy rate, and the mediators were these variables I just mentioned. However, national tightness is still kind of like how do you measure national tightness? Well, we use three variables. Vertical legal restriction is the first one, and vertical legal restriction it's a measure of like how strongly do laws apply to a select minority, namely LGBT laws, abortion, and death penalty. These are vertical restriction laws because these only restrict a subset of the minority, usually enacted by people at the top of the hierarchy to influence some other subset of minority in the society. Then we also have cultural tightness and assortative sociality, which measures people favoring national in-groups over out-groups. Okay. So to examine these variables, the direct curve linear results, to do that, we regressed linear and quadratic terms, latitude terms on literacy. Quadratic terms means that literacy, if significant, literacy is associated with a different relationship above and below the equator. Such that, and we found that literacy increases as it moves poleward, so north or south in both directions. There is no linear relationship of latitude on literacy, but there is a quadratic or a curvilinear relationship on literacy for both males and females. And this only applies for latitude, but not longitude. So what do we make about that? Well, all we know right now is just there seems to be some direct association where latitude, where one's nation's, how north or south they are relative to the equator, predicts literacy rates. But why is that? That's where indirect curvilinear results come in. So indirect meaning we use latitude squares as our IV, predict the mediator, which is one of the ecological stress variables, which in turn predicts literacy rates. And the idea is that higher indirect scores indicate that that particular socio-ecological variable plays a larger role in explaining literacy. So if we look at this table, under indirect effects, all were significant except for cold stress, and all were significant even, and the most significant ecological stress was pathogen stress, which is still significant after everything else was controlled. So what do we make of this? Well, it means that latitude predicts literacy partly because of ecological stress and national tightness and wealth. But if we take the control of everything else, pathogen stress seems to be a very strong variable. Even it has the highest coefficient as well, where latitudes predict how strong of a pathogen prevalence there is, which in turn predicts literacy rates. And as a illustration, literacy is influenced by latitude partly due to ecological stressors. The curvilinear relationship goes something like this. I hope you can see this line, where literacy is partly predicted by latitude. Okay, that's one of the findings of how socio-ecological stressors affect literacy. Now let's actually look at how does it affect politics. So my team recently wrote a paper, a review paper in Current Opinions of Psychology, that showed that volatile environments tend to produce politically conservative people. So political ideology influences many facets of one's life. Consumer behavior, involvement in crime, well-being, even interpersonal relationships. Yes, okay. But where do these political ideologies come from? Why are some people more liberal? Why are some more conservative? Well, if you ask someone that, everyone's going to give you a different answer, and there are many valid answers. And my team, we answered that under the lens of socio-ecological influences on political ideology. So, by reviewing a bunch of past research, we found that from a socio-ecological lens, pathogen prevalence is associated with more conservative values and beliefs, including authoritarianism and support for autocratic governments. Similarly, harsh climates are also associated with ideological conservatism. As climate gets very hot or very cold, those areas tend to produce more authoritarian governments with autocratic legal restrictions. This means laws that are enacted by autocratic governments. Okay. Also on a similar vein, harsh living conditions with frontier topography, such as mountains and isolation and open space, these are also associated with autocratic governments. Probably not isolation, but mostly mountains is the frontier topography. And as additional evidence for harsh living conditions, there have been studies that found that people living in earthquake-decimated areas in Japan and places that are destroyed by wildfires in Russia, they reported conformity-based values and conservative ideological positions. But why? Why do these harsh environments, and by harsh environments, it also includes places with high pathogen stress, places that are too hot or too cold, why do these environments lead to political or associated with political conservatism and authoritarianism? We argue it's because of threat and relational mobility. So first, let's talk about threat. In regions where ecological environments with a lot of threat, it causes people to adapt lifestyles that make them more wary of outgroups and more concerned for in-groups, which is a hallmark of conservative ideology. So take COVID, for example. During the last, there were many instances of some sort of hate, of many types of hate crimes, partly because of perceived pathogen threat. People were more wary of outgroups and more concerned with in-groups. Like outgroups might be um, unfamiliar groups that may carry the virus. In groups, they tend to trust them more, which is also this idea of trusting outgroups, more wary at least, and trusting in groups is more of a hallmark of conservative ideology. Okay, but more generally, environments with a history of threat um, tend to have more laws that are hierarchical and conservative. And in lab studies, people, even in lab studies, you put someone in a lab and you have them memorize some numbers or some set of characters. When you put people under cognitive load, they tend to behave more ideologically conservative or report ideological conservative beliefs as well. Next, we have relational mobility. So relational mobility, it refers to sociological constraints on people's ability to form and sever relationships. So people living in highly relational nations, they tend to have more opportunities to associate and disassociate with the group. In contrast, those in low relational mobility tend to have fewer opportunities to associate or disassociate. So relational mobility is influenced also by historical and ecological threats. So a study found that as a nation experiences more historical and ecological threats, it tends to be more threats being to the right. Relational mobility tends to decrease. As an additional note, those who live in low relational mobile society, their relationships are often formed through proximity and circumstance, not so much through choice. Um, so how does this relate back to our research question? Well, we found that most likely low relational mobility regions with low relational mobility, the people tend to hold more anti-democratic views. They're more anti-political rights and more pro-hierarchy. Why? Because societies with long-lasting networks, people who are around you will be around there for decades. You hang out with the same people for decades on end. Everyone's the same. Not a lot of freedom to dissociate with people or associate with new people. These long-lasting networks tend to produce views that are more collective and authoritarian and discourages alternative lifestyles. Okay. Um, for part three, I'd like to share my first authored paper, which examines how a government, how autocratic or democratic the government is, how that moderates the relationship between cultural variables and legal restriction. Let's break that down. Is a culture of a populace reflected by the laws that govern them? Well, prior research suggests that it is. So, when we examine horizontal restrictions, which means laws that restrict everyone, hence horizontal, and these laws are taxes, speed limits, blood alcohol levels, these restrictions are negatively associated with collectivism. In contrast, vertical restrictions, so laws that are implemented by people in power that only apply to people at a minority of people, such as LGBT rights, abortion, and the death penalty, these vertical restriction laws are positively associated with collectivism. And in prior research, It's likely due to because that's what they found. Now, in the current research, we want to find out whether democracy or autocracy moderates this relationship. So, in democratic countries, citizens have the right to vote and cast their opinions on how laws should be formed. As a result, lawmakers in democracies tend to be quite accountable to the populace. Otherwise, they wouldn't be elected or they wouldn't be re-elected. However, in an autocratic country, the people in charge, they don't have to be elected. They don't have to be accountable to the populace. They can be in charge without getting the approval of the populace. Because of this difference, we wanted to test if culture variables such as collectivism and vertical and legal restriction, if that is moderated on how democratic or how autocratic a country is. And our hypothesis is that the link between culture and legal restriction, it holds for democracies because of accountability, but it does not hold for autocracies because in autocracies, the leaders don't have to be accountable to the population. For the variable autocracy and slash democracy, it was operationalized by averaging the Freedom House indices for civil rights, civil liberties, and political rights. This is just a way to describe the interactive political model. We use the three culture variables and horizontal legal restriction, see if there's a direct relationship, and then examined whether this relationship is moderated by democracy slash autocracy. All variables are continuous, and nation was the unit of analysis. So what did we find? Well, prior research, Conway et al., found that cultural collectivism was negatively associated with horizontal legal restriction, but positively associated with vertical legal restriction. Okay, now what did this work find? We found that for democracies, there is a significant relationship and it points in similar directions, but autocracies, there's none. This is next to nothing. And again, the dependent variable is cultural collectivism. So in democracies, horizontal legal restriction, there's a relationship between horizontal legal restriction and cultural collectivism, or some sort of cultural legal restriction link. But in autocracies, there's none at all. It's very close to zero, actually. What does this mean? Well, this means that the association between cultural variables and legal restriction, it holds for democracies but not autocracies. Tying back to my previous point, because autocracies are less accountable to the populace, theoretical ways that link cultural variables and legal restrictions are less likely for autocracies. After all, what is a culture? Cultures, loosely defined, is just a bunch of shared norms. And cultures are formed by who gets to participate in that culture. So we get to predict democracy and autocracy is a good prediction of what is a good variable to predict whether culture and legal restrictions are associated with each other. And the last piece of research I'd like to share is a recent publication in JSPP about how different ecological stressors, how proximal and distal ecological stressors predict societal confidence. There's a key distinction between distal ecological stressors and proximal ecological stressors. So distal, meaning like very far away, conceptually, these stressors are largely uncontrollable and not easily changed by human activity. So climate and mountain range. Yes, we get that the climate, you can change the climate, that's not what climate change kind of is, but relatively, you can't change climate and mountain ranges as easily as other things such as water or air quality. So proximal stressors are stressors that are more easily altered, such as water or air quality. And because proximal stressors are more easily altered, it is more reasonable to attribute blame to proximal stressors to government, but you can't really attribute blame of distal stressors such as mountain ranges to government policies. Hence, we predicted that proximal stressors would be more impactful for societal confidence. So our research questions were how does proximal and ecological stressors predict four things? Does it predict horizontal and legal vertical restriction? In other words, do these air quality, water quality, climate, do they predict the type of laws that are enacted? That's the first question. The second question is, do the stressors predict subjective freedom, meaning media freedom, political freedom? Um, Third question is, do these stressors predict subjective life satisfaction, meaning personal safety, health problems? And the most important the question was, do these stressors predict societal confidence? Now, societal confidence is a very multifaceted construct. You don't just ask someone, are you confident in society, as in one item and be done with it. That's why we included a bunch of items that gauged societal confidence in many different ways, such as, are they confident in the military, in the judiciary, in government, in financial institution? Do they think businesses are corrupt? Are they confident about the country's leadership? So to examine these research questions, we used Gallup World Poll data, which is included over 1.5 million participants from 2005 and 2017 in 159 nations, to just examine just effects of proximal and distal ecological stress. In the past, there's been a lot of research, quite a bit of research on ecological stress, but these did not distinguish between proximal and distal. So Gallup World Poll, what is it? Gallup World Poll, it collects data every year from a bunch of different countries, and each country, they randomly sample 1,000 people above age 15. They call them and then ask a bunch of these questions, and these questions are all translated and back translated, and a lot of the responses were randomly selected to check for quality control. In short, it's very high quality data, which is very good as well. It's just every year and very current as well. Once again, the unit of analysis is the nation. So to put our variables in like nicer categories, our proximal ecological stressors were air quality and water quality. Our distal ecological stressors were extreme heat, extreme cold, pathogens, inland topography, and mountain topography. Some of these items are taken from the Gallup World Poll, and some of these items were taken from previous indices, such as extreme cold, extreme hot. The same indices were used in the literacy paper. Pathogen, also from a previous paper. Okay, previous indices used by a paper. And for the dependent variables, we use horizontal and vertical legal restrictions, so the same variables used in that autocracy democracy paper just before this one, as well as subjective freedom, life satisfaction, and societal confidence. Now, these latter three variables are all measured by items taken from Gallup World Poll. So, what did we find? Well, first let's answer the first two research questions. So, to proximal and distal ecological stressors, do they predict horizontal and legal restriction? We found that controlling for wealth or not, it largely predicts vertical and horizontal restriction. But note, for distal ecological stressors, there's a difference in the direction of the association. So for distal, there is a positive relationship between distal ecological stressors and vertical legal restrictions, but there's a negative relationship between distal ecological stressors and horizontal legal restrictions. However, there really is no difference in proximal stressors. So what does this mean? If the stressor is considered distal, it seems to predict vertical and horizontal restriction in different ways. Now, for our second research question, do these ecological stressors predict subjective freedom? It seems that it does for both distal and proximal, such that as there's more ecological stressors, people tend to be perceived as less free. Such as air quality and water quality for proximal. If the air quality and water quality is pretty bad, people reported less freedom and media freedom and political expression. For our next research question, the proximal and distal ecological stressors predict life satisfaction. Now, life satisfaction, we uh, measured it with many questions in the Gallup poll, including the satisfaction ladder from 0 to 10, how satisfied they are with their income, healthcare, with their physical surrounding. What they found was that regardless of proximal or distal, as there were more stressors, people were less satisfied with life. And now the most, I guess, important finding, do proximal and distal ecological stressors predict societal confidence? Confidence in government, military, and all business and everything on the list. We found that yes and no, as in distal ecological stressors do not predict confidence in societal institutions, but proximal ecological stressors do. So stressors that are not attributed to blame from the government, stressors such as climate, such as you know things that are beyond human control, those aren't tied to confidence in societal institutions. However, proximal ecological stressors are. So if ecological stressors are perceived to be control or easily altered by human activity, then people are more likely to there's something that people more likely to probably attribute blame and report less confidence in all of these societal institutions. Okay, so in more elegantly, people in countries with more ecological stress, they felt less freedom. They reported reduced well-being and health. Um, and whereas proximal ecological stress was associated with the loss of confidence for society, in societal institution, distal ecological stressors were basically uncorrelated with societal confidence measures. What does this mean, like, today? Well, implications to the pandemic still going on. The pandemic's restrictions will cause decrease in political freedom. Well, it already has, and perceptions of political freedom will decrease the most in areas where COVID is hit the hardest. So, concluding remarks. After sharing my team's work on how do socio-ecological stressors affect things like literacy, affect things like societal confidence, and whether and how places that are more volatile tend to produce more politically conservative people, we found that well, socio-ecological stressors it affect a whole host of psychological outcomes. And my contribution to this body of literature, it's just trying to link socio-ecological stressors to different areas, and also separating ecological stressors for between distal and proximal. So, in sum, future research should continue to examine how pathogen prevalence, such as COVID, how things like climate stress, which is due to climate change, or even just recently, there's been reports of Greenland raining, which means climate change up there has been quite alarming. How do these ecological stressors, how do these impact political orientation, political ideology, and political restriction? I hope my talk was informative and I welcome your questions. Thank you.